Support for WUWM podcasts comes from Potawatomi Casino Hotel Milwaukee, home to 24/7 excitement, dining, and an on-site hotel at 1721 West Canal Street. More information at potawatomi.com.
Lake Effect brings you conversations about what's happening in Milwaukee and the people, places, and organizations that shape the community. This is Lake Effect Spotlight from WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR.
How does Wisconsin keep track of teachers accused of misconduct? That's the subject of a recent year-long investigation by Cap Times reporter Danielle DuClos. She found that between 2018 and 2023, nearly 200 school employees were investigated for sexual misconduct or grooming. Internal records obtained by the Cap Times show the department investigated allegations of sexual assault, educators soliciting nude photos from children, or initiating sexual relationships immediately after students graduated. WUWM education reporter Katherine Kokal is joined by DuClos of the Cap Times to learn about the reporting.
So this investigation took just over a year. You found that our Department of Public Instruction investigated 200 school employees who were accused of sexual misconduct or grooming. Can you tell me, why didn't we know about this before your investigation?
I think it's because no one had asked the question, how often is this happening across Wisconsin? And that's the question the Cap Times set out to answer in its reporting by obtaining public records and reviewing more than 450 license investigations conducted by the Department of Public Instruction. And even then, after reviewing those cases, we were unable to determine the nature of the conduct under investigation for about a fifth of the cases reviewed. So that's about 100 investigations. And so, ultimately, the reporting showed a lack of data and consistent tracking of these behaviors. And so I think that's one of the reasons why this wasn't previously known.
I want to be clear about this. The DPI's investigation is a level above that of a principal or a school district, right? So how soon after an incident does DPI typically investigate allegations like these?
When you're talking about allegations or investigations into sexual misconduct or grooming by educators, there are a bunch of different types of investigations that can occur. And so you're right, there are personnel investigations that can happen at school districts themselves. And then there are criminal investigations that can happen with law enforcement. But this reporting was examining and looking at the license investigations conducted by the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction, which oversees educator licenses throughout the state. And so in terms of when does DPI typically, investigate or start investigating these, it depends on when they get the complaint, right? So they get complaints and reports from multiple different sources. They can get them from parents, community members, even media reports if they see an article that was written about an educator, law enforcement. And then there is another way that they get a lot of complaints and reports from is from school districts themselves. And so under Wisconsin state statute, school districts are required to inform the Department of Public Instruction when an educator resigns or is fired and that employee is suspected to have engaged in, quote, immoral conduct, which is the statutory standard for removing a teaching license and is kind of the statute that they use to investigate these cases. School districts are then also required to let the department know if an employee is charged with certain crimes. So they have to report that as well. And so that is typically how they're getting this information from school districts as well as the larger community.
Well, and information is kind of the whole crux of your story, right? The lack of detail available about these cases was startling to me as a reporter. Can you kind of explain what information members of the public can see when an educator gets into trouble?
Yes, so the Department of Public Instruction does have a public online license status lookup where you can search an educator's name and see if they have an active license, if they're currently under investigation, or if they have surrendered their license or had their license revoked by the department. Any other information, such as why an educator lost their license or gave it up, like the circumstances under which that happened, that is not included on that website. So if you wanted to get more details about why that happened or why an educator was investigated, you would have to file an open records request for that investigation file with the department. And so the Cap Times did do that to see how long it would take to get just 10 educator files for specific educators. We filed that request with the department in April, and we didn't get those records until September, so over 4 months later. And just to put that into perspective, the Department of Public Instruction said it's investigating on average about 113 licenses a year. So 10 files is less than 10% of their annual caseload.
That baffles me because I've previously done education reporting in a state that has much more open records laws, Florida. And I feel like I would request one of these educator files on a Tuesday and it'd be in my email by Thursday. So it's really remarkable to hear how long it takes in Wisconsin, but also how expensive it is, right?
Yes, so the Cap Times sought records not only from the Department of Public Instruction, but also from school districts. And while the Department of Public Instruction provided records for free, that was not the case for school districts. And so the Cap Times submitted the exact same records request to the state's 20 largest school districts by enrollment. And some of their responses were a little surprising to the newsroom. We had a school district come back and quote us $245,000 to provide sexual misconduct records, investigation reports into employees, resignation or separation agreements for investigations they had conducted from 2017 through January of this year. And that was the highest cost that we got from the Janesville School District, but the Middleton School District wanted about $40,000. Sheboygan was asking for a little bit over $17,000. And then there were some school districts like Milwaukee that was asking for about $1,000. But when you start to add up all of those numbers, that's quite expensive.
You point out in the story that misconduct records for doctors, accountants, and manicurists are more publicly accessible than the same types of records for teachers, right? Did you find that this lack of public information protected victims or made them more vulnerable?
So I think a theme I heard from the researchers and prevention advocates I spoke with, they were saying transparency around how often this is happening is key. A researcher and prevention misconduct trainer, Billy Jo Grant, she told me without numbers and understanding of how often this is happening, it's very hard to allocate resources to address this problem for lawmakers to understand it and develop solutions. And so again, the Cap Times reporting is likely an undercount of how often this is actually happening throughout the state of Wisconsin. That's something that advocates and researchers I spoke with said, especially given the about 100 cases we weren't able to categorize the conduct for. And so from a prevention standpoint, a lot of the researchers and advocates I was speaking with really pointed to transparency as being very important to prevent this type of conduct from happening again in the future.
You also point out that educators can actually give up their license in Wisconsin, kind of in lieu of a more thorough investigation. Your reporting found that 1/3 of educators just gave up their licenses voluntarily. What did experts say about why that is and what that means?
So the prevention advocates and researchers I spoke with about voluntary surrenders said it's more the transparency around those surrenders that's important, specifically why an educator surrendered their license. And the reason why they said it's important is in case that person tries to work with children again in a non-licensed role. So whether that be a summer camp counselor or private youth sports coach. And right now, getting access to the why around an educator's license surrender or why their license was revoked by the state would require you to file an open records request with the Department of Public Instruction. And as the Cap Times experience shows, just to get 10 of those files, we waited over 4 months to get a response.
This reporting is already making changes. I understand that Assembly Speaker Robin Vos has weighed in on the issue, and State Rep Amanda Nedweski is drafting legislation to address this. What would legislation on this matter do?
So since Representative Nedweski is drafting those bills, it's unclear without seeing the introduced version exactly how her proposed changes would look in practice. So I'm interested to see when those are introduced, what other lawmakers and stakeholders have to say. But one of the bills she said she is drafting is to prevent educators from being able to voluntarily surrender their education licenses to close a Department of Public Instruction investigation. One of the things the researchers and prevention advocates I spoke with said the concern lines mostly with the transparency on why that educator lost their license or gave up their license and how easily accessible that information is.
Your story includes a quote from an advocacy group executive director where she says the state can either protect those who would abuse our children or they can protect the children, but they can't do both. What do experts see as solutions to this problem?
So this story was just the first article in the series, and we will have further reporting out soon on what other states' policies are in this area. But in terms of what the advocates and researchers for this story told me on license investigations, more consistent and transparent data tracking is important so that the scope of the problem is better understood and that resources can be allocated to address it. Easier access to information about why an educator lost their license, whether it was revoked or the person voluntarily surrendered their license, and also more resources for investigations. As the Department of Public Instruction said themselves, their one full-time and their one part-time investigator is not enough, and the agency said it needs more funding and resources in this area to help it do these investigations. And the researchers and advocates I spoke with also pointed out concerns on their staffing levels given the caseload that they're facing.
Danielle DuClos is a reporter at Cap Times who looked into Wisconsin's tracking of educators investigated for sexual misconduct or grooming. She spoke with WUWM's education reporter, Katherine Kokal.
You can find more interviews like this one by visiting WUWM.com/Lake Effect. And while you're there, subscribe to the Lake Effect Spotlight podcast.